Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Onion Soup. And today I'm truly excited to talk to Mr. Simon about metaphilosophy. How are you doing today?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. I'm excited to be here next year.
Yeah, thanks for coming. So tell us about metaphilosophy and your work.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a philosopher. I've graduated from a grad school in St Andrews in the UK in Scotland, and basically what my work was about from the very beginning was kind of value theory and philosophy with respect to what do we think kind of is better or worse, what do we think is good, what is bad, what is beautiful, what is ugly, these sort of things. And my primary work was in aesthetics, and I was looking at why we classify certain things as artworks, or we consider them more beautiful, or we consider them kind of more worthy of appreciation or evaluation than others. And one of the things that I started working on then was that a lot of the kind of definitions of art or classifications of art that we have are very Western centric. They kind of focus on the way we think about art and well in the West or in the global North, really. And that has to do with just what sort of things are considered art. For example, we consider, I know, painting, sculptures, architecture, music, and literature art, but we don't consider, I know, gardening art. We don't consider, I know, sewing art. We don't consider jewelry making art, these sort of things, right? And in other cultures, they might totally be art as well. So what I was doing was exploring this idea that maybe what we consider to be art is culturally sensitive, or it's like dependent on where we are in culture. And similarly, you could say other kind of values, be it ethical values or aesthetic values, might be relative to those things. And I was really interested in this partially because, like in my whole education and philosophy, I was taught literally nothing about all of the other big traditions of philosophy that have been flourishing around the world, and be it in China or be it in India, and be it in Mesoamerican cultures or in Africa or in other places. And they're fascinating and really rich cultures of philosophical thought. And they're just not taught at Western universities. So I started this project, which was meant to address this issue, and it's been running for 9 years right now. It's called the Diversity Reading List, and basically, there, what we are doing is we are trying to promote the work of people who write in these sort of traditions, people who come from various underrepresented groups and want to do philosophy in a slightly different way, or things that focus on the philosophies of, well, the sort of philosophies that are just not being taught in Western philosophy departments. So I've been running that project for about 9 years. I've done some research on the topic as well. I've written about how we classify and categorize philosophy, and how this is kind of very biased towards the way that philosophy is done in the West, and specifically in the Anglo-American analytic tradition. And this is what metaphilosophy is, right? Metaphilosophy is this kind of reflection about how we do philosophy, how we, like, why do we think in this way rather than in another way. So my work has been very much in this kind of questioning. Well, why is it that we think this way rather than the other way? Like, let's explore all of those other ways and see what's valuable and important in them as well. Mhm.
Wow, that is directly up my alley. So when I was taking philosophy, I took a couple of philosophy classes, but most notable was the philosophy of science. And I agree with you. We started diving more deeply into Western and European ideals of philosophy, and we didn't really touch on the other aspects of the world. And as an individual who is also interested in theology, spirituality, and just all things really, I want to dive more deeply into like the I Ching and like Taoism, but I want to dive into like Ifa and the African culture. I want to dive into the Native Americans, the South Americans, but they just don't talk about that from a philosophical standpoint or from a religious or theological standpoint. So, why do you think that is? How did we get so focused and fixated that philosophy comes purely from the Western European nations?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think it basically comes down to all of those, well, colonial imperialist attitudes that we inherited, unfortunately, from our ancestors, in which, well, people just did think that everything European, everything white, everything male is
Mhm.
better. And until now, the academia and so many other wakes of life are still kind of following in this wake. And I think that the way that teaching in the academia is done is very much kind of I don't know, neo-colonial, but definitely post-colonial. Definitely, it's informed by those things. And to some extent, you can, like, understand that from, like, the way that people defend it very often is to say that, well, our tradition is so rich
Mm,
that in order to teach those other things, well, we would need to give up on something, right? I mean, we only have that many hours of teaching in a semester. We only have that many years in a curriculum. So we would need to give up something. And there's so much to teach about already that we can't really give up on a lot of things. Well, I think that's potentially an argument, but then it would be much more intellectually honest to not call yourself the Department of Philosophy, but rather the Department of Western Philosophy, for example. And that's fair enough. Maybe you only want to graduate in Western philosophy, but I think it is misleading to basically paint this image in which, the only things that are worth investigating, the only things that are worth thinking about come from a certain culture or from a certain cultural background. And like I say, I mean, you're probably very aware that this is exactly how people thought in the colonial past and still think right now. That we can tell all of those other people how to think because we know better. And this is part of what my project is trying to do as well, right? Is challenge this sort of thinking, because very often also people do this unreflectively. It's not that they do it because they actually really hold the belief that everything white male and English speaking is better, right? It's just that's how they were taught. That's how they were taught, right? That's what they know. So when they go on to teach, they just teach the same stuff that they were taught themselves, and kind of like the system perpetuates itself in a way, right? So part of the point of my project is to give people, like, open this door for people. You might not know anything about all of those other things, but you might be interested. Here it is. Go and explore, and it kind of gives people an opportunity to to explore all those things and include them in their teaching as well, learn it themselves, and teach it to their students.
yeah, I 100% agree with you. I don't think that most people are teaching Western philosophy out of some type of, like, agenda or some type of malicious
Hmm.
intent that, safeguard the rest of the information in the world. I just think that it's been perpetuated, throughout the years that people go in and when we think philosophy, we do instantly turn to the ancient Western philosophers,
Hmm.
instantly when we think philosophy, we're taught Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, but we don't
Exactly.
go into, like, Lao Tzu. We don't talk about those other philosophers. So when you started diving into philosophy of different cultures and different nations, are there any that spoke to you more than others?
So yeah, I mean, I have to say that I have also done a certain amount of this diving. I'm by no means a specialist in all of those other cultures myself. I work very hard to promote it towards other people as well. But I have actually found a lot and for myself and Confucian and Neo-Confucian philosophy, because I am, well, before that I was very kind of interested in Aristotelian virtue ethics and this kind of idea that we live that to kind of perfect ourselves or to live our best lives or achieve some sort of eudaimonia, how Aristotle called it, so some sort of human flourishing. And I think that he offers very well one perspective on how this is done, but the perspective that Confucius and Neo-Confucianists like Maosa or other people are offering is, it's quite different, but it's also really interesting. And this whole idea of how you need to kind of work on yourself and kind of put your own house in order before you can actually move on to, I don't know, organized societies, organizing states, and all that, and all the advice that Confucius is giving you on that is extremely valuable. And I think that it kind of helped me in my life as well. And I think that the best philosophy should also teach you something about your own life. But it also opened my eyes to, well, the same subjects can be approached from a slightly different angle. And it really opens your eyes to like all of those other possibilities. Hmm.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that because I also started diving deep into Confucianism when I first got
Hmm.
into when I started diving deeply into theology, you can't help but not to come across Confucianism and Buddhism and things like that. And one of the books that really helped me out more recently was Secrets of the Golden Flower. It's
Hmm.
not Confucius specifically, but it has a lot of those elements in there. So, as you start diving more deeply into helping people to understand philosophy from various aspects and just questioning philosophy as itself, which to me is so meta. I guess that's why it's called meta philosophy.
Precisely, yeah.
you know? So, how do you actually approach that? Because do you just give people a ton of books to read? Or do you say, hey, start here, look over here? Or do you ask someone perhaps what they might be interested in?
Right. So, I mean, there's two kind of aspects of what I do in this respect. One is the project that I'm running, the diversity reading list, and another is my own research. Right. So, starting from the second, it's kind of making people notice things that they don't notice. Because, like you say, very often it's not that people want to do the wrong thing, right? It's
Mhm.
just they're just unreflective about this. They don't notice those things. So I wrote a couple of papers, for example, that are criticizing the way we classify philosophy, and they're kind of online databases of philosophy text, for example, right? Or there's like encyclopedias of philosophy and all that. And what they do is they, well, kind of categorize it, right? They classify it. They say those things belong together. This is, we divide, I don't know, moral philosophy, we divide it into applied ethics, meta ethics, and normative ethics. We divide epistemology into, I know, social epistemology, and there's all sorts of like divisions in which people act, um, in which they categorize philosophy. And I was looking at those category systems that they're using and noticing there's quite a few things in there that kind of are not value neutral. They're not just telling you how things are, they're kind of passing a judgment on what's important, on what's complicated, on what's worth your attention and what's not. So some of the things I noticed, for example, is that in many of those systems, feminist philosophy would appear, or like categories that focus on feminist philosophy, so be it, feminist ontology or feminist ethics or feminist whatever, right? They would appear under miscellaneous sections.
Mm.
What's in the miscellaneous section? Well, what's in the miscellaneous section is all the stuff that didn't fit anywhere else, right? So what message does it send? Well, it sends the message that that's kind of the less important stuff. Yeah. Or for example, one of the biggest databases called PhilPapers, they categorize philosophy in such a way that they have their categories. In every single category, everything is arranged alphabetically, right? So it's kind of like a value neutral way of arranging things. But the top level categories are not. They are arranged starting from metaphysics and epistemology, then they're going into value theory, then they're going into philosophy of science, then they're going into history of Western philosophy, and then they're going into other philosophical traditions, and so on, right? So it's not an alphabetical arrangement. Instead, it's kind of an arrangement that goes like the first things are the most important things. So, what message does it send? Well, metaphysics and epistemology are much more important than, for example, any value theory. Everything that has to do with Western analytic philosophy is much more important than all of the other philosophical traditions, right? And all of these sort of things. And then when you dive deeper into it as well, you notice that a lot of the time different categories are kind of subdivided in many ways. And you would reasonably expect that if something has many subdivisions, it's a really complex thing, right? But if something doesn't have many subdivisions, then you go like, well, it's probably not that complex. Yeah? And then you notice suddenly that like all of the things that are subdivided much more are the things that have to do with Western philosophy, Western analytic philosophy. The non-Western philosophy is just like, let's just throw those things in a bunch, right? And it makes you question. It's just like, well, the people who are doing these sort of things pass on certain value judgments, right? Some things are more important, some things are more complicated, some things are more worth of your attention than other things. And I think it's one of those things that we kind of don't notice it unless someone points it out to us. And then when it's pointed out to us, you can't stop unseeing it. Yeah, you can't unsee it. So that was part of my work. That was part of kind of like making people notice the things that is kind of easy to not notice normally.
So
And
when you were talking about that, I was actually
Mhm,
thinking, I wonder if it has to do with public interest, because right now public interest is towards metaphysics as opposed to, it makes sense to me that the philosophy of science is third, but metaphysics is right
mhm,
at the top, and then value theory is somewhere in between. But
mhm.
then we kind of get into the argument of knowledge and awareness, because if you're not aware of the other fields, then how can you even have interest in them?
Well, and that's the thing. Is I think that if you have a category system like that, then, well, you have it for a reason, right? You have it so that people can browse it and people can find stuff in it. If you tuck some things into, categories that are somewhere there under miscellaneous, then people won't find it, or people will, not explore in this direction. There's many things, for example, that I don't know, even like the Confucian, neo-Confucian stuff that we are talking about, a lot of that has to do with various aspects of either political philosophy or moral philosophy, right? And a lot of those things are categorized in the system as Chinese moral philosophy.
Mhm.
But what is Chinese moral philosophy? Well, it's moral philosophy, right? So why are they categorized there? And you have to go to the special category to find it. But if you're just browsing the regular category of moral philosophy or normative ethics or whatever else, you don't find those things. Yeah. So then it's as this question of like, is the system, what is the system serving? Is it serving you being able to find everything, or is it serving you being able to find the things that are, you know, by the mainstream considered the more important? And if you want to find anything else, you need to really try. And I think that we should reverse this. I think that we should change the way that the mainstream kind of perceives those things, because they're not less important.
Yeah.
And it's just, again, kind of post-colonial thinking that makes us put it in this way.
Interesting. I do agree with that. I agree with the fact that if you have to preface with the fact that it's Chinese, Western, or African, you kind
Hmm.
of get away from the idea of the philosophical construct in the first place, because you're already subcategorizing it into something that's really unnecessary. When if you type in moral philosophy, it should bring up a script that has all of these different aspects in there. You shouldn't have to say, "Well, I wanna know moral philosophy of this particular group of people." No, I wanna know moral philosophy in the whole totality of moral philosophy.
Absolutely. So what we are actually doing right now with my diversity reading list is, we, after writing those papers, me and my collaborators in there, we have applied for a grant from the American Philosophical Association, and we have won it, and so that we can create a better category system. And we're actually working on it right now. And what you just said is very much a big premise of it. So we're trying to get rid of all of this, is it in this tradition or is it in that tradition or something like that, and not make it part of the category tree at all. It's rather, you're looking for a topic such as moral philosophy, for example, right? And then by default, it shows you absolutely everything. And then you can filter it if you want to, because sometimes people are looking for a specific thing, but you need to make this conscious choice to filter it out, right? It's not like by default you're shown the kind of dominant culture and you need to make a conscious choice to find all of the other things. No, by default you're shown to everything, and you need to make a conscious choice to only see the things that you're actually, specifically looking for.
Wow, I love that. I love that it calls attention to the fact that you chose to filter, you chose to limit your awareness of certain things. And again, if you're doing research on something that's very specific, then that would make sense. But if you're just doing research for yourself, you would want to have all the information at your fingertips and not feel as if you're being gatekeeped.
Absolutely. And I wrote this little piece for the Philosophers magazine at some point as well, in which I kind of argue that, like, this is the core of philosophy. This is the core of the, I know, academic work at all. It's just like this curiosity. It's just wanting to know more, wanting to, like, if you're exploring a topic, why wouldn't you want to learn absolutely everything from every single angle about it, right? Why would you want to limit yourself? Makes no sense. This is like completely antithetic to the idea of philosophy itself and of any, frankly, academic discipline. Limiting yourself sounds like a horrible idea, or limiting yourself by default, at least. Obviously, once you're delving deeper and specializing and all that, you
Mhm.
need to limit it somehow. It's impossible to know absolutely everything. But you should never escape from all of those other ideas that might challenge what you already think you know.
Yeah, and that's great because for me, I talk to people about my views on academia, and I have degrees and stuff, but when I decided the reason I decided not to go get a PhD was it wasn't that I didn't want or desire a PhD, but then I realized it was simply just a sheet of paper, and the knowledge itself is free, and what was I planning on doing with this? I genuinely enjoy knowledge for the sake of knowledge. So I sit down and I read everything, but when you go to get a PhD, you end up having to specialize and then it starts to narrow your view on a particular topic. Now, if that's what you need to do, that's fine for your work or whatever it is. But for me, as an individual who just likes to read as a scholar, that's not necessarily what I was looking for. So I just went out on my own and started reading books. And I have my small little library right here beside me, and I think that's just a more effective approach to knowledge.
I mean, fantastic. I think that, how many ways to do it is there? I mean, as many there are people. Everyone has their own approach, and that's perfectly fine. I don't think that there is anything, to take away from your approach by the fact that other people choose to do something else, nor vice versa. I think that, the world is big. There's space for everyone doing it their own way.
So, as a philosopher, just kind of getting off topic a little,
Hmm.
we talk a lot about good and bad and right and wrong. So, when it comes to the moral argument, what is morality?
Oh wow, well, that is a big question. How many hours do we have until the end of this
Right.
podcast?
If we go over time, it's perfectly fine.
Right. I mean, in moral philosophy, there's different branches of ethics. So I mentioned already, we've typically talk about applied ethics, we talk about normative ethics, and we talk about meta ethics. And normative ethics typically is the one that is most people think about when they think about it, because normative ethics is kind of the trying to figure out what it is that is good and what it is that is bad, right? And this is what many kind of theories have been developed around. And I think that right now there are the three dominant ways of thinking about this, really. And there are many kind of combinations of them and many kind of different takes on it, but those three have proven to be the most prevalent. And one of them is derived from Immanuel Kant, and it's called deontology, or people talk about it as Kantianism. And it has to do with kind of the idea is that all actions follow some sort of rules, right? If you decide to not steal from someone, you're following a rule, do not steal. And it's the rule that matters, right? Following the right rules is what makes your action right. Then there is the kind of approach that we call consequentialism, or a specific type of it called utilitarianism, favored by John Stuart Mill. And the idea in that is that it's not the rule that matters, it's the consequences that matter. So if you steal something, but it means that you can, for example, feed your starving family, and you're stealing from someone who won't even notice that anyway, or maybe you're Robin Hood or something like this, right? And you're actually, then you go like, okay, you kind of didn't follow the right rule, but actually the outcome is really good. And it's the outcome that matters. Yeah? And then in many cases, these sort of approaches will have a very similar, they will predict a very similar thing, like the same actions are right or the same actions are wrong. But sometimes they won't. Yeah? So if you have a question, for example, of, I don't know, should we, kill one terrorist if it means that we can save 1,000 people, right? Then a deontologist might kind of struggle and go like, thou shalt not kill. That's the end of the story, right? But the utilitarian will go like, one person versus 1,000. I know which one is the better outcome, right? And we're going to go for this. But most of the time in life, we don't deal with these sort of things, and there's typically kind of more nuanced approaches to that. So, for example, a a deontologist might say something like, okay, well, the rule isn't don't kill. The rule is something a bit more nuanced. So, for example, don't kill, unnecessarily, or something like that. And if it's necessary to kill, actually, it's fine. Yeah. Or a utilitarian might go like, well, you might also say something like, okay, so if a healthy person walks into a hospital, right? And in this hospital, you have two people who need a kidney transplant, two people who need a lung transplant, one person who needs a heart transplant, one person who needs a liver transplant, and all that, right? Then it's okay to kill this one person so that you get all of those organs and save 10 other people. Well, that's ridiculous, right? You wouldn't want something like that. Nobody would ever go to a hospital if that was what's happening. So you might go like, yes, it kind of seems like you have better consequences. You kill one person and you save 10 or something like that. But that's not what matters in here. What matters in here is that, like, by doing that, you also create the consequence of nobody trusting hospitals.
Mhm.
Or like you wouldn't want to live in a world in which you can walk into a hospital and that could happen to you, right? So the consequences would actually be more nuanced or more subtle. So, but that's a kind of two like big ways of thinking about this that are kind of focused either on the causes or on the rules that you're following or the consequences that you're following. And another way of thinking about it stems back to Aristotle, and it's called virtue ethics. And this is the approach that says that what really matters is not necessarily the reasons or the consequences. The thing that matters is the person in the middle, the person who makes the call, the person who makes the judgment. Are they a virtuous person? Are they the sort of person you would trust for these sort of things? Is what they're doing virtuous? And Aristotle had this idea of virtues being the golden middle between vices. So, for example, if you act in a courageous way, it's acting in a way that's in between something that you would call the vice of deficiency, which is you're being craven, right? Or a vice of excess. So you're being just too, I don't know, brazen. You kind of like run into danger for no reason, or you like risk everything for, despite the fact that there isn't really a need for that. And obviously, being craven means that you like don't have any courage at all. So the virtuous person is the person who knows the middle path, knows how to do that, and the ethical or the right thing to do is to follow virtue. And there's many other virtues that you can think of, like wisdom, for example, or I don't know, benevolence, or things like this. And then, yeah, and then what is good is following these virtues. So that is a very shortened and kind of on the and surface explanation, but this is what moral philosophy very largely is kind of focusing on, right? Because in real life, we do have very different intuitions about all of those things, yeah, and they come up in everyday discussions. So imagine, for example, that I don't know, a oh, we had this discussion at some point. Supermarkets, they start doing things that are more environmentally friendly, right? So they, for example, don't give you plastic bags for free, or they change the packaging of things, or maybe they change their transport or some other things like that, right? But do they do that because they believe it's the right thing to do, or do they do that because they know that their customers are a bit more worried about all of those things and they want to retain the customers? So it's just like it's really a marketing thing for them. They don't really care about the environment, they don't care about the earth and all that. They just want to keep their customers, right? So if you're a utilitarian, you might say, well, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what their motivations are. At the end of the day, there's less plastic bags. At the end of the day, there's less plastic packaging. Awesome. Some good has been done. Yeah. But if you're a deontologist, you might go like, they're not doing it for the right reasons. They're just being selfish. This is not good at all. This is just like, oh, it might have good consequences, but it's not really good. Yeah. And so, there's many of those kind of like everyday situations in which people largely disagree about all of those things. Yeah.
Wow. You did a great job explaining all of that, and I have so many other questions because it brought into mind cultural differences from a philosophical standpoint and brought
Hmm.
into time period and societal differences from a philosophical standpoint because different cultures look at crime and punishment differently. Different cultures
Hmm.
have different views on virtue. And throughout the history of man, the things that we valued just change. Those shift and those adjust. In what ways, and we don't have that much more time left, but in what ways has our value system changed from culture to culture and throughout time?
Sure, that's a very good point. So I think that a lot of the time it's useful also to focus, like you say, on values. And our values might be something like freedom or safety or privacy or friendship or love or community or things like this, right? Values tend to be the sort of things that you don't like further justify. If someone asks you, why are you doing a podcast? And I go like, well, because I want to tell people something interesting. Well, why do you want to tell people something interesting? Well, because I think that it's better for the world to have people who are educated about this thing. Why do you think education is good? And so forth, right? And at some point, like when someone asks you, well, why do you think education is good? For example, you just go like, it just is. There is no other reason for that. It's better to be smart than to be not smart, right? And that is when you have arrived at the value because you don't justify it any further. It's kind of at the bottom. Yeah. And I think that a lot of the time, it's not that people disagree what those values are. We all think that education is good, that safety is good, that friendship is good, that, I don't know, privacy is good, or other things like that. Yeah. But what we do disagree on is which ones are more important than others. And very often those values come into conflict. So a typical conflict, I teach data ethics a lot, for example. A typical conflict is between your privacy and your autonomy and your security and safety on the other hand, right? So do you, for example, have cameras on every corner of the street? Yeah. What they do, those cameras, is they deprive you of privacy. They mean that you cannot do certain things without being seen. But what they give you in return is a certain feeling of safety. Yeah. And there's so many other things where we make these sort of trade-offs. And the trade-off of security for autonomy is definitely one, but there's so many more. We give up so much for convenience, for example. Convenience is one of the values as well, right? We might want to, I don't know, give up privacy when we're using Facebook because we get some convenience and we get some connection with friends. Yeah. And there's those tensions between those different values, and those differences between cultures that you mentioned, and between people, or people who are on different sides of the political spectrum, for example, and all that, tend to be the differences in how much they think those different values are worth and which ones are more important. If you are faced with a trade-off between safety and freedom, which one do you choose? If you're a liberal, you're probably choosing freedom over safety. But if you're a conservative, you might choose safety over freedom, right? If you are from a certain culture in which, let's say, like in the Western culture, modesty and purity are not considered such important virtues, right? You might answer a different question as to, for example, how a woman can dress or how a person can dress out on the street. And you might focus on their freedom. You might focus on, nobody should tell them their autonomy. Nobody should tell them what they're supposed to do. But if you're from a culture in which you put a much greater stress on, chastity or purity or all of those other virtues, you might go like, no, these are more important than your freedom. Like, we can actually limit your freedom so that you have score higher on those virtues if you or those values if you want. So I think a lot of the time these sort of disagreements just come in the form of, well, which are the values that we consider more important?
Mm. So when we talk about a culture that's more progressive,
Hmm.
excuse me, will we say that that more progressive culture tends to value freedom more so than safety or modesty?
I mean, that's the words that we're using very often right now, right? So I think progressive is kind of, it's a loaded word as well, because obviously the progressives call themselves progressives, right? And they see it as a positive thing. But the it's not like the conservatives who don't see this as a positive would attach such a positive value to progressive, or even call progressives progressives, right? They would call them woke or something else
Mhm,
like that that doesn't have the same sort of positive undertone. So I think that the words that we use also have, in philosophy we call them thick concepts as well.
mhm,
So there's some words that are what you would call, I don't know, thin concepts or something like that. I know, table, chair, lamp, whatever, right? They just mean the thing they mean. But then there's some concepts that are thick concepts, and what that characterizes them is that they have a value attached to them. So when you say home, or you say mother, or you say progressive, or something like that, it doesn't just say the thing. It also says, no, it's a good thing. It's something that makes you feel good. It's something that makes you feel like, or if you say some other things that make you feel bad, like, I don't know, corruption or something like that, right? It doesn't just describe the thing, it also carries the value judgment. It's a bad thing. So I think that very often when we describe ourselves and we describe others, we use these sort of concepts. So, notice, for example, in the abortion debate, right? Like, the people call themselves pro-life or pro-choice, right? They don't call themselves pro-death and pro, I don't know, against choice or something like this, right? Because those are negative ways to put it, and they carry negative connotations. No, they call themselves the nice ways.
mhm. Wow, it's funny you say that because right, I was the whole time you're saying, I was thinking, well, that's connotation versus denotative, because
Hmm.
you have things such as like a cup, and there's no emotional, for the most part, no emotional
Hmm.
attachment to the cup unless there's something very specific there.
Right.
But when we talk about, like you said, pro-life versus or pro-life, pro-choice, no one is going around saying pro-death. No one says, but there are people who are against or who are for abortion.
Hmm.
And but how do you promote that without being looked at negatively? When we
Right.
look at words across cultures, it's really interesting to me how one word can be translated kind of differently and have a completely different definition in a different culture, such as God versus Jesus, which are actually two different definitions.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this is part of what philosophy is useful for, and what I think it can bring to people's lives as well. Because so often we see it as this kind of academic discipline and the ivory tower of the academia, and like nobody really cares what those
Yeah.
philosophers are talking about. But and to be fair, many philosophers are fit the picture, right? They don't really talk to people outside in the world either. But I think that there's so much that actually, you know a regular person could benefit from in there. And a big part of it is being able to question all of those things that we kind of take for granted and don't really consider. Like, what do those words actually mean, and why are we using those words rather than others? Like, what hides behind this concept? What does it tell you about the person who's using it? What does it tell you about their values? What does it tell you about how they think? And these sort of things. And that's also a part of what I'm trying to do as well. So, like, I'm outside of the academia, I started this outreach project that focuses on modern masculinity as well. It's called the Man's Compass. And then I'm trying to do exactly something like this by drawing men's attention to the way that masculinity has been shaped over the centuries, right? And so often we just kind of like play a role from the guidebook without really thinking about it, or just like, why is it that men should dress a certain way, or why is it that men should behave in a certain way, or why is it that hierarchies between men matter so much, or why is it that you gain power as a man in those specific ways and not others, for example. Yeah. And then so many of us kind of play those roles quite unreflectively. And what philosophy can do is to kind of, take you by the neck and kind of force you to go like, wait, no, think about it.
Mm,
Why is it like this? Like, is it good? And here we come back to the moral philosophy as well, right? Like, you might go, okay, this is how I've been brought up to think about myself, my gender, the way I act in the world, the way I'm allowed to behave or not allowed to behave, what makes me weak or what makes me strong, what makes me attractive, what makes me unattractive. I've been told all of those things, but are they good things?
mm,
Maybe they've been made up at a different time when things were different about the world, right? Or maybe they were made up by people who had a vested interest. And for example, keeping men working hard and working ridiculously long hours, and instead of rebelling against this, seeing this as some sort of virtue of, I'm the provider of my family and I take pride in this, right?
mm,
It's a very pernicious thing when you go like, okay, what is this whole like myth of a man as a protector and a provider? Like, whom does it serve?
mm,
Well, when you think about it, it really serves the few men who are actually in power. Because if you're a protector, well, you're willing to risk your life to save someone else, right? If you're a provider, you're willing to spend loads and loads of time, of your own time that you could be spending on stuff that matters to you,
mm,
I don't know, boosting the GDP and creating value for your family and for other people, right? And like, it doesn't really benefit you, but it does benefit somebody. Who is this somebody? I can bet you that right now in the war in Ukraine, right? Many of the men who are fighting there, they see themselves as protectors and providers. They see themselves as protectors of their country, right? But they didn't choose this war. If they could, they probably would much rather be home and not risk their lives.
mm,
Meanwhile, the men who did choose this war, they're safe in their cabinets and they're not really risking very much themselves, right? There's this great quote that describes what war is, that war is a situation in which young men who don't hate each other fight for the cause and die for the cause of all the men who do know each other.
mm. Interesting.
And it makes you think like, why should we do that, but also like, we do have those ingrained cultural myths and values about what it is to be a man. For example, it includes being a provider, being a fighter, and being all of that, that kind of perpetuate it, right? Instead of stopping and thinking like, why should I fight a war for some old dude that has completely different values than me? Like, no, i'm not going to do that. No, instead we fall in line and we just follow the kind of things that we've been told. And similarly, instead of going like, why should I work ridiculously long hours to provide for all of the people? Why is the system set up like this, right? Instead, we just fall in line because we fit the kind of mold of being this protector and provider. So that's one of the things that I've been also doing, trying to like bring this philosophy that people do in the academia that some might seem quite cerebral and like ivory tower, and take it out and actually talk to, make it relevant to everyday issues. And I think that masculinity and the way that men are kind of very often just playing from the script without questioning the script is an absolutely fantastic space in which to explore that.
Interesting, interesting. What I meant to say earlier was God in Dios, not God in Jesus.
Hmm.
But when I was in the army, and I never got deployed or anything like that. But when I was
Hmm.
in the Army, I would talk to my friends who are Rangers who are all, in Afghanistan and Iraq, and I would ask them about the war, like how they felt about it and being, uh, ultimately just fighting a cause for governments. And what they told me was, when you're actually out there, you're really not even fighting for your country at that point. You're fighting for your brother and your friend that's standing beside you, because this is about safety and about getting each other home. And I found that to be really interesting, because when you start to break things down as far as what is a protector, it's exactly like you said. Who said that the man has to be the protector? When a lioness is known to go out and take out entire uh, encampments. I mean, they feed their tribes for their children, and the lion is the protector, sure, but the lioness is the one that goes out to provide. How do you think we got to a place where the patriarchy really took over and matriarchal societies kind of just fell behind?
Yeah, good question. I mean, this is a phenomenon that has happened across the world, and there are very few matriarchal societies in the entire world. So realistically, the history of that goes back millennia. And I think I'm not a specialist on this, but as far as I understand, a big contributor to that is the invention of agriculture. For what research we have about prehistoric humans who are hunters gatherers, most of the hunter gatherer societies are not necessarily patriarchal societies. And, we know that partially because in the age of European exploration around 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, there were a number of those hunter-gatherer societies that were still encountered by the then travelers. And part of the things that they observed was that the gender roles in there were not quite as pronounced. But we also have some research kind of that suggests that kind of historical research. What happens and with the invention of agriculture is that women who would have previously only have one or two babies, which would, having a child effectively puts you out of the workforce for some time. As hunter gatherers, they couldn't really have more anyway because the hunting pack could not support more kids anyway. So basically, they typically would kind of keep their numbers steady and stable. So women would typically have two kids. But once agriculture enters the picture, you can create a surplus, which means that there is a situation in which you can grow your societies. And what this created is a situation in which women were effectively, well, pregnant or nursing or and care of kids for most of their lives or for a large part of their lives, which effectively also pushed them out of, well, just the possibility of focusing on politics, on social aspects and stuff like this. And I'm sure that men were all too happy to use this opportunity to take this power into their hands. Mm, I'm sure that there is a host of other reasons as well. I think that probably the biological reasons have a little bit to do with that, with men being naturally a bit more muscular, stronger, and stuff like that. But they probably don't have that much to do with this. It's mostly a cultural thing. So, for better or worse, and probably for worse, this is how the history of humanity has worked out. And I think that a large part of what we should be doing right now is kind of, well, asking again those questions like, is it good? For whom is it good? Because I don't think that the patriarchy realistically is actually that good for most men either. And I think it's useful to kind of go back to what the word patriarchy actually means, right? It's not the rule of men,
Mhm,
it's pater arche. So arche is the role or the ruler, and pater is the father.
mhm,
It's the father. Who is the father? The father is the man who is in charge, right? He's the man in power. And the patriarchy is not the rule of all men. It's the rule of the man in power. And once again, it's not that, all of those people who go to, or of those young men who go to war, they necessarily want to do that, right? No, they're sent there by someone in power. Yeah. And I think that it would be really useful for many men to kind of get past this common perception that when someone starts talking about the patriarchy, they blame them,
mhm,
specifically them, personally, right? And instead start thinking about this, no, the patriarchy is this kind of system in which it is the few powerful men who actually get to call the shots, who might give you a little bit of power just so that you don't question things too much and don't complain and don't start to have thoughts about you know uh, pushing them off their thrones. And but really, you're not the main beneficiary of this. And it is in so many ways that the patriarchy is actually harming men as well. That if I think more men were aware of this, it would be much easier also to kind of create this more, I don't know, unified front in which it isn't really that we're kind of like fighting men against women or like patriarchy against feminism or something like this, but rather we're fighting, well, all of the people who are actually screwed over by the patriarchy against the actual patriarchs, who are the very few men on top. And I think that in this respect, for most men, actually, they might not see it, but they have a common cause with most women or people of any gender to actually overthrow the patriarchy as well. And like it's part of my work as well. It's what I'm trying to show people. But I think it's once again the patriarchy is this. It's once again a thick concept. You know, it has this negative connotation, and unfortunately it has this connotation that like you are if you're a man, you're personally being attacked or blamed for something, right? You are part of the problem. Whenever someone uses the word patriarchy, you know it's a bad thing and it's about you. And that makes people resistant. That makes people go defensive. And unfortunately, it's one of those words that, well, it's hard to change the fact that this is how it is used right now. And for example, in my own practice, I kind of try to avoid it if I can, because I don't want to get people defensive before they actually start thinking. Because you know how it is when you tell people like, "Oh, there is this social system that is making things difficult for you, and you should really question it." They go like, "Oh, okay, maybe you've got a point, right?" But if you say, the patriarchy is making things difficult. I'm not listening anymore. I use the word no, goodbye now, right? So it's important to be sensitive about that as well. I think when we talk to people and kind of acknowledge how people react to those words, because they're those thick concepts that carry those value judgments with it.
Oh, wow. So taking it back to when we were talking about Aristotle earlier
Mhm.
and with virtue, how do we come to a place of virtue such as neutrality instead of looking at things from a male dominant or female dominant society? How can we really bring everything together in union?
Oh wow! I mean, if I knew, I would have saved the world by now.
Right.
I can't really fully answer this question, but I think that practicing moderation is a good thing, and practicing this, it's usually referred to as intellectual humility. It's practicing this skill of like having the humility to admit that you don't know everything, and that maybe, just maybe, the person who disagrees with you has got a point. Yeah, that maybe they're not evil, stupid, and all of the worst things, but maybe there's something in what they're saying that is actually worth listening to. And I think that the modern world is polarizing us, and there's so many forces that are doing it either intentionally or very often unintentionally. There is a big discussion in data ethics and generally in kind of all of the things to do with technology and social media. To what extent the algorithms that Meta and Twitter and TikTok and all of the other people are designing, they're designing them to get people as hooked as possible, to get people as interested as possible and all that. And the unintended consequence of that is that, well, it turns out that the best way to keep people hooked is to get them emotionally involved in something. And the shortest path to a click is to get you angry, right? So those algorithms have just learned that the best way to make us interested in something, to make us spend more time on the platform, is to polarize us. Because if we're polarized, if we really disagree with something, it makes us angry. And if it makes us angry, we're going to click and we're going to write this angry comment and we're going to spend another 5 minutes and watch another five ads, right? So there's this phenomenon in which, despite the fact that nobody really intended it, it's not like Mark Zuckerberg was sitting in his basement going like, how much money I can make by polarizing society. They just wanted to make money by keeping people on the platform, but it ended up polarizing society. So there's so many forces right now that act against this Aristotelian virtue of the golden middle, right? They push you to the extremes. They go like, no, you should be angry about this. You shouldn't listen to what the other people have to say. They're stupid. They're evil. And write those angry comments to tell them, right? And they reward you for it. Because when you do, you get all of those sweet likes and you get all of those sweet comments that, engagement and all of that. So they promote effectively this sort of engagement. And I think if we want to work towards a more equal world in which we follow the sort of Aristotelian virtues, we need to really resist this. And it's not easy because, those things are hooking into our brains and the way that our brains have evolved to reward us for attention, for getting likes and stuff like that. And we need to actually resist this and kind of go like, no, I'm not going to buy into this system. Instead, I am going to listen to what the other people are saying. I'm not going to, quickly react to all of the angry comments. I'm going to read the detailed analysis that actually takes the middle ground. Yeah. And I think that it's really important that all of us who realize this spend some time on promoting that as well, because I mean, human brains work the way human brains work. You get a dopamine shot when someone gives you a like. That's just it, It's and people are hijacking it the same way as, I don't know, gambling is hijacking it, or cocaine is hijacking it, or I know pornography is hijacking it. The same way social media are hijacking it, and there is no way to go around it unless we can really modify, the architecture of our brains. We're not there yet, so we really need more people to work hard against that sort of stuff, and to really promote the idea that, yeah, you should actually really, listen to the other side, be intellectually humble, and not give in to this quick dopamine shot of just being angry and polarized.
Wow, hence why Confucianism was so alluring because it's about
i'm
working on yourself.
I'm really glad you brought it up. And I should have totally mentioned that because, yeah, I focus on Aristotle, and see, that's the thing. Again, this is my education because this is what I've been taught, and I don't, like, this is not where my mind instantly goes. But you're absolutely right. This is a perfectly related to Confucianism just as well. So thank you for bringing it up.
Yeah, no, it's been great. Well, I would love to keep talking to you, but we are all out of
Mhm.
time today.
That has been a long conversation. Thank you for taking the
It
time.
has. Do you have anything that you'd like with the audience before we go?
Yeah, I think that I have this one thought that I always bring up, and it is going to be from Western philosophy again. I'm sorry, but but it's a thing that Plato and Socrates were all about, and it's a dictum that was written on top of the Delphic Oracle in Greece, and that Socrates has kind of read and then tried to share with other people, and the words were "Know thyself." And I think the world would be so much better, and all of us would live our lives in such a more intentional way, doing things like questioning, why does masculinity require us to do those things rather than others, right? Why do those algorithms work this way than others? If we spend more time focusing on knowing ourselves and not playing from the scripts that the society is trying to push us into, but really inquiring what it is that I think, what it is that I want, what it is that I need, and that's actually following this rather than following all of those other things. So that's my parting thought for you guys. Spend some time trying to really focus on knowing yourself. And if you're interested in exploring that a bit further, I've got a bunch of materials about this online as well. You can follow me. Just type in my name into Google, and it will come up with my website. It'll come up with my YouTube channel. And if you're interested in diversifying philosophy and all of those other philosophical traditions, type in diversityreadinglist.org, all one word, diversityreadinglist.org, and you will find all of those materials that we've put together. And it's not only interesting text and philosophy, it's kind of like ready-made classes, entire classes in philosophy, like, I don't know, African philosophy and feminist logic and decolonial philosophy and all sorts of other topics that you're not normally taught at universities. You can explore in there and delve much deeper. Like Dexter, you said you might want to prefer to do it, at your own leisure rather than necessarily a part of the university. Well, we've given you all the materials for you to do that if you'd like to.
Wow, thank you so much, Simon, for coming on. I want to thank everybody for watching this episode of Onion Soup. It has been a great one. I had a great time today. All right. Thank you, Simon. Have a great one. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Fantastic. Thank you for the invite. Bye, everyone.